There will be a general discussion after all the presentation. So we start the next presenter. Now let's start with Dr. Tsui Lik Hang, Tsui Lik Hang 先生. Please start your presentation. It's okay?
Okay, thank you,
so much.
Professor Uchida.
All right.
I'll share my slides here. So let me know if you have problems seeing my
I can
slides
see.
Here.
Okay.
Okay, great.
Okay, no problem. Yes.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for having me in this great symposium. It's wonderful to see some old friends and make some new ones. Remember Dr. Sun went to the same conference as myself. I think it was last year about ancient books. So it's a pleasure. And of course, Simon is a longtime old friend. So I'll be talking about digital humanities, especially for Chinese studies. So I'm asked to say some words about the current trends and reflect on the collaborations between China and other countries in terms of digital humanities research. So I'm glad, of course, that I'll be sharing these with you. But if you experience interruptions on Zoom, do feel free to interrupt me, right? Because sometimes those things do happen. So a little bit about how we are doing this. So I'm based in City University of Hong Kong, and we actually have a research cluster in our College of Liberal Arts and Social Sciences, and that is the Digital Society Research Cluster. And it's through this cluster that some of our activities are organized for digital humanities and digital culture. So today I would like to speak to you about digital humanities, of course, for Chinese studies. And I've been working on it for some time now. So I want to spend a little bit of time to give you what I know about the background of the field. And I will begin from its past development. I will talk about a bit of its history, and I'll also then go on to reflect on its present state and also look ahead to its future. So basically, I'm adopting a pretty simple chronological approach here. And in my view, no single unified definition of DH is possible. It's not easy to impose a definition and apply it to every language, every culture. And it is this scholarly context that we are focused on today in East Asia for this symposium. And I myself will focus especially on the scholarly context that DH was introduced, was debated, and developed specifically in the Greater China region. And of course, this context is quite different from that in communities elsewhere, especially where DH research originated. This partly is because of the features of data in Chinese. Also, of course, due to the features of textual data, especially in Chinese language, and also due to the context in which it was introduced. So as you could see from my slide, the word itself, DH, digital humanities, when it's rendered into Chinese, it's translated into several different terms, right? 数字人文, 数位人文, 数码人文. In mainland China, in Taiwan, and in Hong Kong, quite differently. And this is in itself an indication of the context already. The original context when the term was introduced and translated to these regions. And for historical research, which I will focus on, especially since this is my academic background, I would argue that if any part of the research process cycle is influenced by digital media, I will see it as part of a form of digital humanities work, or more specifically, digital history. For historians, there are usually three main processes. And of course, Professor Shen here, who is with us, will know this much better than I do. You know, he is an esteemed historian himself. So the first step, of course, the gathering of historical sources or research materials. And step two, we think about those sources, we read them, we digest them to process and analyze the sources. And step three, you know, the final stage in the cycle, and that is the presentation of our results or research outcomes. You know, the stuff that we write, right? The discussions that we present to our peers in academia. All three stages, I would say, are now much affected by what we would call DH, broadly speaking, or more specifically, digital history. So I'll try to unpack the issue of DH emerging as a field in China and Chinese studies. And of course, the field itself has a history of its own. So basically, what I'm sharing with you today, very quickly, will be based on these things. It will be based on some of my work that I've done previously, which I hope to share here. I'm putting this Dropbox link to the chat box, and you should be able to access these three articles, which is basically my take on this issue. First of all, the prehistory of what I call the digital, the DH paradigm, the prehistory of the DH paradigm in mainland China, Taiwan, and Hong Kong. And the second will be about the present, the time that we are in right now. And this is the phase when the paradigm has already emerged and has increasingly been attracting attention. And this will be from 2009 onwards. And I'll also talk about some of the thoughts and proposals that I've made with some of my colleagues about a possible vision for the future of DH for Chinese studies, especially in terms of cyber infrastructure. So I'll focus my talk today on China. A fourth article that is soon to come out. This is probably coming out in 2022. So we've been waiting for some time, but our treatment of the subject, including by myself and my collaborators, will not only be confined to mainland China, because of course Chinese studies is not only within China, right? So Chinese studies in the PRC and also in Taiwan and in Hong Kong, as well as overseas, internationally, or what sometimes what we in China will call 汉学 or 海外汉学 usually. And the developments in these three societies often flow towards each other. They impact each other in terms of digital humanities about China at the international level. So first of all, the basis on which all this is developed, at least in terms of what I'm more familiar with. First of all, the modern and classical Chinese language. Right? This, of course, presents already technical challenges in digitizing, organizing, and mining of Chinese texts. So for instance, like what you see on the slide here, on the left is a page from a printed book. Basically, it's a scholarly work on officials in Tang China, in the Tang Dynasty, okay? And on the right is an OCR digital text. By OCR, of course, I mean the use of optical character recognition to convert images that contain Chinese characters into digital text here. And this is something we are already doing with our computers and even our smartphones nowadays. You know, we could do that easily with our smartphones. But still, it has been quite difficult to achieve complete accuracy. With the thousands of Chinese characters, this is still quite a challenge, technically, to capture these characters into digital text. So if you pay attention carefully to the text, you will actually identify some errors on the right side. So even though we are seeing algorithms that are improving, this OCR technology is still far from perfect nowadays. And of course, we're just talking about printed text, right? With manuscripts, that's a much more complex issue even. So especially for Chinese texts, right? And it doesn't just stop there, right? Another big challenge would be, especially for classical Chinese texts, right? Boundaries, for words, there are no spaces to mark words in traditional Chinese books usually. So such as a printed text that I take from an ancient book, a wood block printed book. Every character is a unique Chinese character, and it just flows and flows. Of course, when we feed this text onto computers, it's not like an English text that we usually have with spaces marking the word boundaries and so on. So the machine has to make sense where a word stops. And of course, that would help if we train the machines, such as if we tag them manually and so on. And of course, we're just only talking about text, really. I haven't gone on to talk about other kinds of data. But already with digitizing textual data through OCR and processing them, we do see these challenges. And these are problems, of course, that scholars have encountered in developing DH, especially from the 1970s and 1980s. So this is where we begin with the prehistory of DH in China. It was about the 1970s when attempts were made to process Chinese on computers. And this is not only for China or for the Chinese language, right? Because these characters matter for other cultures as well, for other East Asian languages that adopt characters such as Japanese and so on. Back in the 1980s, this was one of the main issues, the encoding of Chinese language. So especially when the encoding emerged from the early 1980s onwards, a lot of improvements have taken place, and the conditions have become ripe for the digitization of Chinese texts. So first of all, you see what's been done. These were in linguistic research. Linguistic experts were among the earliest to adopt digital technologies to study humanities materials in China. Especially in 1976, when a group in Wuhan experimented the use of computers to calculate the frequency of words or characters, Chinese characters used in this famous modern Chinese novel, Lao She's Camel, 骆驼祥子. So by calculating the frequency of characters used, the idea is to have a more accurate picture of language use in this novel. And of course, as an example for the entire language. So starting from that, there have been some projects that I've listed here in the late 1970s and 80s about modern Chinese language and contemporary Chinese usage. These are Chinese corpora that are established in mainland China, and I indicate here the number of characters of these corpora. So for example, 5 million, 20 million, 1.07 million, so on and so forth. These are all quite large in scale, at least judging from sort of the time that we're talking about. And all these examples here are for modern Chinese. And that's, of course, technically because it's easier due to the features that I've just mentioned when I talked about the challenges. But these are fruitful attempts that prepare the field for more complex research. There also have been, in the early 1990s, work like these that I list here, including at the Chinese University of Hong Kong, work on some major dictionaries of Chinese, of Mandarin, and Cantonese, and so on. These resources have been developed as an attempt to reorganize linguistic material and to digitize them, to turn them into data that could be queried or searched through. It's also reorganizing these linguistic materials so as to make them online and available to the public, transforming them into digitally organized data online. So even though computational linguistics is sometimes categorized as a field that is intersecting with digital humanities, and linguistics as a discipline have been somewhat more welcoming to computation and digitization. Linguists and computational linguists have prepared, at least technologically, the work done by digital humanists for Chinese studies. And so these constitute the first wave in DH prehistory that we're talking about. Another wave that's quite interesting would, of course, be GIS, especially historical GIS. It is a field that is deeply involved in digitization before the paradigm of DH has been introduced, including it being introduced to China. So first of all, the efforts in GIS include some of the projects by the Research Institute in Taiwan, Academia Sinica, including this one, the Chinese Civilization in Time and Space. And it had quite an impact on historical research on China, on Chinese history. And Academia Sinica has developed spatial data for historical China, including time-specific periods. So for instance, this this GIS dataset for Tang, China. Of course, it's based on previous work that are paper-based, but it paved the way for more HGIS work, especially in the 1990s. And something like this also emerged separately in mainland China, including the project that came out from Fudan University, CHGIS, the CHGIS project at Fudan and Harvard University, which was launched in 2001. And CHGIS is a database of populated places and historical administrative units for Chinese history. So with these kinds of preparations for during the prehistory of DH for Chinese academia, especially in the 1980s and 1990s, there have been larger scale digitization projects. And of course, these begin with Chinese texts, right? Chinese books. First of all, the 25 standard histories. These would be histories that were compiled by imperial dynasties. These would constitute the most basic historical records from 221 BC to 1912. AD. And so that's the first part of the basic historical sources that have been digitized for Chinese humanities. And this has been done also by Academia Sinica in Taiwan through this Scripta Sinica project, Hanzi. It's a full text database, and it plays a role that is somewhat similar to Google Books for China historians for ancient Chinese sources. And of course, it amounts to billions of Chinese characters. So the 25 standard histories and also the Siku Quanshu, the complete library of the 4 branches. It's basically a huge collection of 3,000 plus books compiled in the 18th century. And it's, of course, one of the main sources for imperial Chinese history. It contains 2 million pages and 8 million characters. This time, it's done by a Hong Kong company collaborating with mainland Chinese scholars and also partially with Microsoft. So before everything else, these 2 main sources became what was most basic for the study of the traditional Chinese humanities for scholars studying these topics. And of course, there are other examples that I won't have time to go into detail, such as the indexes and concordances that have been digitized in Hong Kong and so on. There are also digitization initiatives in Taiwan by museums, by archives and libraries, dating back to the 1990s and on to the 2010s. These are large-scale digitization projects conducted by public institutions in Taiwan. But the basic idea is this, this section that I've just gone through. During the late 1990s to the 2010s, there have been these mass digitization campaigns by government institutions and also by commercial companies. But based on this, this phase, there has still been a gap between the users of this data and also the providers of these data sets and databases. The data accumulated by these libraries, as well as museums and archives, have been huge. But there is this kind of gap that scholars increasingly realize that is a problem, especially from the mid-2000s onwards. And the problem is this: there's more and more data that have been created based on cultural artifacts, including historical texts, museum artifacts, or even non-tangible cultural heritage. But what do we do with all this data? How should scholars make use of them? And this is the gap that researchers have identified, and they've been trying to tackle this gap, especially from the 2000s. And this brings us, of course, to the time when it's important for scholars to think of new perspectives in order to make use of this huge data and to develop more intelligent and powerful ways for research for the humanities. So from the 1990s to the 2000s, we're starting to see some initiatives that have emerged that are collaborative internationally by design. This would include databases like this, the database for a study of modern Chinese thought and literature. It's still ongoing, this project, and it has explored this approach to history, the conceptual history approach, especially based on the statistical analysis of key terms in history, especially for political history. So this database, initially based in Hong Kong and then later in Taiwan, the kinds of historical texts that they use especially are periodicals from modern China, periodicals, journals, and newspapers. So as you see, I extracted one of the graphs from one of their research papers. And you could see, their researchers doing analysis on the keywords on the constitutional monarchical movement in late Qing China. So this kind of conceptual history approach has established a model for research on historical sources, first digitizing them and then subjecting them to quantitative analysis. And this project in itself, it's international by design and also collaborative. So people involved are sort of, it's not just one person that do not do research individually. They involve a lot of people. They involve also scholars from across disciplines, including literary scholars, historians, statisticians, programmers, so on and so forth. Another example that I'm familiar with would be CBDB, the China Biographical Database. It's also a collaboration between Chinese scholars and also overseas institutions. So it's in particular a collaboration between Harvard University, Academia Sinica, and Peking University in Beijing. CBDB originated as a data 1980s, developed by one historian, and of course, it grew and grew. I mean, it's still ongoing and it's massive nowadays. I have worked with them as a postdoc researcher earlier, so it's a project that I've been personally involved in. And the basic goal of the database is this: it's to include all significant biographies as data from Chinese history, especially from the Tang to the Qing. So from the 7th century to the 19th century. And nowadays, it already includes more than 400,000 people from Imperial China. So if you try to turn all this elite biographies from Chinese history into digital data, you have this huge database that allows you to do all kinds of analyses as historians. So it's this kind of big data that you could use to do different kinds of research, such as GIS, statistical analysis, or social networks analysis, and so on. And of course, the data is not as big as our current contemporary concept of big data, but in terms of historical data, it's already much bigger than what historians usually deal with. Historians often focus on one person or one text. That's very common, as you know. But now with the development of these databases, such as CBDB, it's much easier to combine a lot of data points, hundreds and thousands of data points. And we could ask a lot of questions based on the data that is ingrained in the records about these historical figures, such as where the civil service examination degree holders came from in Song, China. So these are people who have succeeded in the examinations from the 10th century to the 12th century, which is the Northern Song dynasty. So based on, and of course, this database is based on all kinds of sources, right? It's based on primary sources and also secondary sources for studying Chinese history. The primary sources would be textual usually, and the secondary sources would be published books on these history and in printed form. So when we're digitizing all this, we would need to cut them up, cut these books up. Some of these books are actually cut up, and we scan these pages through these high-speed scanners and use the images for OCR. And of course, the challenges that I've talked about remain, right? the OCR algorithms are not perfect, so we need to collate and proofread them. So we still need a lot of human input to weed out mistakes, to correct them, so that we have high quality data. So with this phase, I wrap up this section on the prehistory and also the 2000s. And so we see DH is built on this substantial preparation from the prehistory phase. And this is where the emergence of the DH paradigm comes into play. It's when this, in 2009, the year 2009 was definitely a milestone for the emergence of this paradigm in China. It's becoming the next big thing in the US during that time. And it also was picked up by scholars in China and also in Taiwan. So including this professor at Wuhan University, Professor Wang Xiaoguang. He is an information science expert, and he remarked back then that the DH paradigm actually was quite close to some of the projects that have been already operating during that time in China. And he wrote a piece that introduced this idea of the digital humanities and also analyzed some of the examples from overseas, including in China, including in Japan. You know, he had some Japanese collaborators, and also in the UK, in the US, and so on. And he mentioned that the conditions are already ripe for the introduction of this paradigm to China. And this, of course, indicates that the field is beginning to take shape. Scholars are looking for inspiration on how to make use of these digital collections that have already been built. So it's with this development that we see the emergence of this paradigm of DH. And of course, it's since then that we see many more projects and also the beginning of some scholarly publications in the field. Of course, with these, there is still a lot of skepticism and reluctance among mainstream humanities scholars towards DH and digital history. And some of them even reject the kind of research practice that DH entails. And I think this is due to some understandings about DH, including one common misunderstanding about DH in the country is how research questions can directly yield different answers from employing digital tools and methods. This is, of course, something to debate about. And also there is another understanding that I think needs discussing is a lot of historians assume that DH is solely about using quantitative methods, about counting in their view, counting and numbers. And if your research does not concern numbers, then there's no use for digital analysis. That's sort of the general feeling among some historians. And there are also other historians that think DH only means full text searches. It's only for acquiring historical sources. So in terms of the research process cycle, it's only for the first step. It's only for searching and looking for and capturing those parts of historical sources. So for scholars, if they hold these kind of views, they do not see the use of further utilization of data that is conventionally recognized in DH research. And I think this is the situation until the 2010s, except for several subfields, except for these subfields that I highlight here, except for historical GIS, except for quantitative history, and also for historical social networks analysis. These subfields are, of course, more open to computation and digitization, and so more welcoming to the DH idea. And so this is basically the sort of landscape that we're looking at since 2009, the formal introduction of the paradigm of DH. And here comes my final part, where I talk about some of the forward-looking perspectives. And I would like to here focus on the building of cyber infrastructure. A cyber infrastructure, according to this report from the American Council of Learned Societies in 2005, is basically a call for more connections and more sharing of resources. And of course, it's an infrastructure. It's an infrastructure for people to share resources for digital research. And the resources would include both the tangible and the intangible. So of course, in this time and day, there is so much scholarly data around for Chinese studies alone, including the zombie databases that Dr. Sun had mentioned, right? These zombie databases that no one gets to access, actually. They lead to a lot of wasted resources and a lot of data loss, in fact. So with a cyber infrastructure, these are things that we could deal with. These are things that we could avoid. There would be better sharing and communication and coordination. So it's almost like a bigger system. It's like a bigger system. It's like a connected infrastructure that would help us access all different kinds of data sources based on the consent of the sort of the data providers and owners in interoperable and in compatible ways. And of course, it's not only about the data collections. We access collections, of course, but we now also access collections through tools, through digital tools. In this regard, the most noticeable development, I would say, from the 2010s onwards would be the emergence of platforms, of research platforms for Chinese studies. These are many new platforms for scholarly data, especially for people who study Chinese, the Chinese humanities. And it's a combination of the data itself and also the tools for using the data. It's for researchers to utilize the data for visualizing and presenting the information in new ways. And also allowing them to share it, to share the research data with our peers. So these platforms have built-in tools to make it easier for everyone. So you don't need to be very good at coding, and you don't need to build your own tools. So I've listed some of these examples here. A lot of these are still undergoing development and are becoming increasingly active, including this GIS platform, this 学术地图发布平台 at Zhejiang University. It's for academic maps, for disseminating spatial data online. There's also the Shanghai Library open data platform, aiming to make available linked open data for Chinese studies, especially based on their collections. They have an excellent collection of genealogies and rare books and so on. There's also DocuSky that's coming out from National Taiwan University, which carries a lot of visualization functions. Also from Taiwan, there's the DH research platform. And also from mostly Leiden University, there's Marcus, which is a textual tagging tool and analytical tool, especially for classical Chinese, but gradually branching out to other languages as well. So we see more and more of these, and I would call this the platformization, in fact, for the platformization for Chinese humanities or for Chinese DH. And of course, this is going to change the picture again, right? These would be, I think, a pretty good step for building a cyber infrastructure and for more sharing, for shifting the culture about sharing, about disseminating research data, and about presenting them to others. So based on what I've discussed so far, I would want to quickly reflect on what DH brings to academia in the Greater China region, especially on its current trends and so on. I'll try to sum up my observations very quickly. So first of all, in the prehistory of Chinese DH, most projects were financed and supported by institutes or governmental bodies. But from the early 2000s onwards, the cost of developing databases, datasets are beginning to drop. And it's starting to become possible for scholarly institutes or even individuals to develop datasets and their own digital projects. And this is the process where we see the earlier paradigm of DH taking place. The transformation of humanities computing into a DH paradigm, especially for China in the early 2010s that I just shared with you. And secondly, I think another change that is gradually taking place is that the disciplinary boundaries are starting to blur. Of course, they still exist in DH research. And of course, they used to pose a much more serious obstacle in an earlier stage. It's not easy for scholars to break these boundaries, especially when we are all nested in our own academic environments, in our own disciplinary contexts. But we see more and more younger scholars and junior colleagues trying to reach out and get out of their comfort zones and disciplinary environments. There is definitely a lot more interdisciplinarity. And the point is that although we see many DH research centers in the Greater China region already, based in various universities, it still is not an independent academic field. DH is still not a field in its own, but it's already driving a lot of teamwork, and that's a good sign. It's helping scholars to team up with collaborators and work as a group. And of course, this is quite new for some of us in the humanities. A lot of humanities scholars work on their own previously. And DH had created the opportunities for us to engage in different ways, to collaborate, to analyze materials together, to co-author papers together, to develop projects together. And so moving on, right? This of course creates implications for evaluative systems. It also creates implications for teaching and resource support. The current curriculum, be it in mainland China or Hong Kong, I think still doesn't provide the basic skills that's required for DH research work in the humanities disciplines. This forces us in the DH field to be proactive. The focal point, I think, for this would be the building of a cyber infrastructure. If we have better communication, if we have better coordination, then our data could be created and utilized more effectively. Learning resources could also be shared more effectively. And I hope these efforts to construct this cyber infrastructure, especially for my own field, in the traditional Chinese humanities would materialize. We already see some discussions about the construction of this cyber infrastructure underway. And of course, there are still challenges, right? A lot of DH research in Chinese studies is not easily translatable internationally. There are still challenges with internationalization for the field of Chinese DH. And of course, although we know that there is a prehistory, like what I've said, for Chinese DH, but we still are still seeing the beginning of such efforts. The efforts for internationalization, for development of shared resources, so on and so forth. It's still a fairly new and exciting field. And there's a lot of green grass for every one of us to graze on. And it's with this that I want to end my sharing. And I would like to thank you for your time.
Oh.
That's all from me.
Thank you, Tsui Lik Hang. Thank you so much.